Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do a little radians introduction here. We're going to start talking about different ways you can measure angles. So far we've pretty much done everything in degrees, but we might also want to start talking about radians. Radians are a different way to measure angles, and a radian comes from this idea right here. So if you take the radius of a circle and you take that length and you fold it around the outside of the circle, this length is one radius. This blue length is one radius along the outside, that arc length. And the angle that's formed is called a radian. Now, you might know the formula for a circumference of a circle is 2 pi r. Well, if the circumference is all the way around and a radius is going to be what I'm wrapping around the circle, it's going to take 2 pi of them to make it all the way around the circle. So 2 pi is the amount of radians in a circle, and we divide the whole thing up into chunks. So the first thing that might be helpful is to start thinking about just the quadrant angles. So if you say these angles 180, 360, 360 is 2 pi radians. If this is 2 pi radians, then half of that is pi radians. Half of pi radians will be 90 degrees, that's pi over 2. So 180 is pi radians, 90 degrees is pi over 2. Now we can also count by halves and say this is 1 half, this is 2 halves, which we represent as 1 whole. This is 3 halves, so 3 pi over 2s, 3 halves of pi. And then this is 4 halves, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 over 2 is 2 whole. So 270 is 3 pi over 2. What I've done is divided up the unit circle into some grids here, and we're going to just talk specifically about reference angles. So if we do, let's do the ones we just did. These are the pi over 2 reference angles, the quadrant angles. This is pi over 2, this is pi, this is 3 pi over 2, and then this would be 4 pi over 2, which we say is 2 pi. So if you got 0, 90, 180, 270 degrees, that's how we'd write it. If we're going to do, let's say, the 45 degree reference angles, which is pi over 4, so these are all the pi over 4 reference angles, which is 45 degrees. Break it up into chunks. Say, if this is half, and that's half of that, then this is 1/4 of pi. So this is 1 pi over 4. And you can kind of start to count. This is pi over 4. This is 2 pi over 4. This is 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, pi, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 6 over 4 is 3 over 2, 7 pi over 4. Those are all your reference angles. Why did I write 6? I might have been saying 6. 5 pi over 4. 1 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4. Those are all your reference angles for 45 degrees. Let's do the 30 degree reference angle. So that's these guys and these guys. So if you think about it in terms of a fraction, these are all my pi over 6's, because if pi is 180 degrees, what's 180 degrees divided by 30 degrees? It's 6. So if you flip that, you got 1 over 6. It's 1/6 of pi. So this is 1 pi over 6. Now that's 30 degrees. This will be 60 here, which we're not going to write right now. So 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6. How I remember this is I go back to pi and say pi is 6 pi over 6. So if you go one less than that, this is 5 pi over 6. If you go one more than that, that's 7 pi over 6. So we've got 1 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6. Well, this is also 12 pi over 6. If you go one less than that, it's 11 pi over 6. Because 12 over 6 is 2 whole, that's 11 pi over 6. So we're dealing with fractions here in terms of pi. But you can kind of organize your thoughts this way. The last ways right here, the last reference angles, are your 60 degree reference angles, which is pi over 3. So if pi is 180, 180 divided by 3 is 60. So this is 1 pi over 3. This is 2 pi over 3's, 120 degrees. 3 pi over 3's. This is 3 over 3. This is 4 pi over 3's. 5 pi over 3's, and then 6 pi over 3's is 2 pi. So organizing your unit circle into different types of reference angles oftentimes helps people sort of label all their radians. But there's only 4 options. You have your pi over 2s, pi over 6s, pi over 4s, and pi over 3s as your reference angles. I'm going to fill in the whole unit circle here using radians. I'm not going to do it with degrees, but I'm going to try and count by pi over 6s. So if this is pi over 6 radians, then this is 2 pi over 6. 60 degrees is 2 of those. So 2 over 6 is 1/3. So this is pi over 3. This would be 30, 60, 90. 3 pi over 6. 3 over 6 is 1 over 2. 4 pi over 6. 4 over 6 is 2/3. 5 pi over 6. 6 pi over 6s is pi. 7 pi over 6. 8 pi over 6. 8 over 6 is 4/3. 9 over 6 is 3/2. 10 over 6. 10 over 6 is 5 pi over 3, 5/3. 11 pi over 6, and then 12 pi over 6. So this could be 0 or it could be 2 pi. That's counting by 30 degrees, but I missed my 45-degree angle, so I'll go back and do those now. This is pi over 4, 2 over 4, 3 over 4, 4 over 4 is 1, 5 over 4, 6 over 4, 6 over 4 is 3 over 2, 7 over 4. Now we have all the angles in radians. I'll list the terminal points as well. These are the same as degrees. 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, 0, negative 1. There's my quadrant angles. I'll do my 30-degree reference angles. So those all have, if you look at this triangle here, the long side is the x, that's radical 3 over 2. And the short side is the y, that's 1/2. So here it's negative and positive. Here they're both negative. And here it's positive and negative. 45-degree angles are pi over 4, radical 2 over 2, radical 2 over 2, and then I'm just changing the signs. Radical 2 over 2, radical 2 over 2, negative. Radical 2 over 2, radical 2 over 2, they're both negative. Radical 2 over 2, radical 2 over 2, just y is negative. Last up, I've got my 60-degree reference angles. So here you've got this 30, 60, 90 triangle. The base is the short side, so that's 1/2, and then radical 3 over 2, so they get flipped. 1/2 radical 3 over 2, but in the second quadrant, x is negative. 1/2 radical 3 over 2, they're both negative. 1/2 radical 3 over 2, just y is negative. So that's my whole unit circle. In radians, you definitely need to have all those angles memorized, and you definitely need to have all those terminal points memorized. And if you can do that, the unit circle and all these trig functions that go along with it are going to be a whole lot easier. So that's all I got. Have a good day.